welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, Mr. DV What. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Battle of Cannae, or Cannae. I'm going to be pronouncing some Roman Latin things today, Tony, and I might get them wrong, and I want to apologize if I do to anybody who's an expert about this. But this story is going to take us all the way back to 217 BC. And in 217 BC, Rome was in an uproar. Twice, their legendary armies had faced off against the Carthaginian forces led by Hannibal, and twice they had been soundly defeated. And now, those same forces were marching toward Rome itself. Now, the Romans hated Hannibal. And not just because he kicked their butts. It was because he kicked their butts in a really unfair way, Tony. Everybody at the time knew that the right way to fight was to line up your army on open ground, right across from the other army, and charge into each other head on. But Hannibal cheated. He did things like ambushing and attacking the flank. And the Romans could not put up with that kind of Punic nonsense. Something had to be done to protect the city.
So you're saying that just because he was, actually using tactics and trying to preserve his men instead of running into a wall, they were offended?
I know it sounds silly, Tony, but this is legit how the Romans felt. They thought that Hannibal was somehow being dishonest by hiding his guys when it helped him out and having people laying in wait for the army to pass by and then attacking them from the rear. I tried to think of a modern day analogy, and I think it would be equivalent to being upset that you go into a country with your uniformed forces and they have to deal with insurgents who won't put on a uniform and fight you in the open, but instead dress like everybody else and leave booby traps behind.
Yeah, roadside bombs, all that sort of stuff.
Right.
It's like warfare is kind of predicated on dishonesty if you really are doing it correctly. That's like half of the art of war is using deception to actually get the better advantage in warfare.
So the Senate of Rome has to take drastic action. And the drastic action they take to deal with this Hannibal threat is to appoint a dictator. Now, point of clarification, in these days, the word dictator did not have the same negative connotation that it does today. Appointing a dictator was a lot similar to what you might see today if there was a big disaster and martial law was declared. It was an emergency action that was intended to suspend the law long enough to deal with the emergency, and then normal action would recompense afterwards. Dictators were only allowed to act to solve the problem they had been appointed to deal with, and they were required to step down from their office after 6 months. This would still come back to bite Rome later, but in this instance, and in other instances, it actually worked out pretty well for them to have a way to step above sort of the squabbling of politics and the Senate and just get stuff done. Even so, appointing a dictator was a big step. Legally speaking, the dictator was supposed to be nominated by the consuls, who had been approved to nominate a dictator by the Senate. The consuls were kind of like presidents in the day, but there were two of them. So imagine the president and the vice president, but if they had the same amount of power, that was sort of how Rome operated at the time. They had two guys at the top. The Senate would elect those guys. The way it was set up was that one of these guys was supposed to approve the choice of the dictator as the Senate had suggested it, but because Hannibal is wrecking shop all in the Roman countryside, the current consuls are actually out trying to deal with Hannibal, and so the Senate has to sort of go around what would normally be done and appoint the dictator themselves.
And a lot of times these sort of consuls and dictators kind of had a rivalry between each other, right? They were trying to compete to see who could conquer the most land, who could come back with the most glory for Rome.
I didn't get into that too much in this story as far as the consuls go. Essentially, it was a balance of power kind of thing. Don't give everything to one guy because that might be a problem, so let him split the power between two. And if there's fighting, then at least that stops one person from taking over everything. But in this case, one of the consuls has been killed off. As I mentioned, the other one is dealing with Hannibal's forces in an ongoing fashion. So the Senate elects or votes to put a man named Quintus Fabius Maximus in charge. And his nickname was Verrucus, which means warty. So Fabius the Warty gets put in charge. And Fabius the Warty is the safest choice you could have. You can tell that these guys are nervous about going off script with what they're doing here, that they don't have the approval of the consul. So they're trying to keep it as by the books in other ways as possible. Fabius has been a consul himself in the past, and he may have even already one time been a dictator, although the sources are a little bit tricky on that. I was not able to get definitive evidence one way or the other. It seems like experts disagree. And not only had Fabius already held this position, but his attitude towards the war was very wait and see, let's make sure we're doing the right thing. He was not a rash man. He was not inclined to action when action was not warranted. And that was actually going to be one of the criticisms people would level against him later on in the story.
And it's something that, like, I would see as a good thing in somebody that's literally got thousands of lives under them, that you want to take your time and figure out that you're doing things correctly.
The other thing that the Senate does to balance all of this out, since everything is highly irregular at this point, is they take the initiative to appoint the Master of Cavalry. Now, normally the dictator would have the right to do this, and the Master of Cavalry, it's another one of these division of government kind of things, so nothing is under one person at all times. The Romans spent a lot of time thinking about this division stuff and making sure that one person didn't get all the power. Again, eventually it did go bad for him, but they had a pretty good system trying to stop that. And the Master of Cavalry is basically exactly what it sounds like. He was the guy who would lead the cavalry portion of the army, and even though he would technically be under the dictator, the fact that he's leading a significant portion of the army on his own means that there's still a little bit of a check against that dictator taking over. And the Senate, by appointing someone to this spot, and someone who is, in fact, a political opponent of Fabius Maximus, again, they're taking all of the chances they possibly can to make sure that nothing goes haywire in the wake of them putting up a dictator when they're really not legally allowed to.
It's like, in a situation like that, you've really got to hope that their best interests are for Rome and that they can find a way to get along even if they are rivals.
Exactly. And Fabius gets right to work, and interestingly enough, this is not about good ideas, Tony. We're going to get to the Battle of Cannae and all of the horrible things that happened, but I really was impressed with this guy's leadership before and after the disaster that he tried to prevent. He immediately goes to work attacking the problem of morale at home. He actually has the position that the reason that the Romans have failed twice already pretty horrifically in the face of Hannibal of Carthage is that they have not paid sufficient homage to the gods. He puts forth that there is this failure of piety in the Roman populace and that they need to turn back to their gods. And regardless of how you think about spirituality in real life, what this does from a strategic standpoint is it gives the Roman people something to do, because most of them aren't in the military. It doesn't help him to have people at home feeling like they're about to get beat down, that there's nothing that they can do, that this force from another land is just going to overwhelm them, and all of these battles are happening far off. By giving them this idea of, hey, get back to piety, he's actually giving them something to occupy themselves with.
Yeah, it's also a way of getting rid of that feeling of complete powerlessness.
Exactly. And again, maybe you're cynical about spirituality and you're like, well, that's a lie. It's a very useful lie in this case, at least. The next thing he does after rebuilding the morale of the populace at home is he starts trying to rebuild the morale of the army. These guys have suffered 2 pretty major defeats in the face of Hannibal's forces, and Fabius, knowing that Hannibal's forces are very well trained and that any direct engagement will probably result in disaster, contents himself with just skirmishing on the edges. He harasses small parties that have been broken off from Hannibal's army. He tries to limit Hannibal's access to crops and fields and burns things in front of Hannibal's army so that he doesn't have as much food. His tactic is a delaying, stalling, starvation tactic. And he gives his guys, if maybe not big wins, but at least stops them from having any major losses so that the army can start to feel like maybe they're not completely helpless again. But his caution is not without its detractors, especially because of one instance where he actually gets the Carthaginians trapped in a relatively small mountain pass that they can't get through, and Hannibal, in a brilliant bit of maneuvering, manages to get his guys through the Roman ranks. He sets a bunch of bulls' horns on fire. He ties torches to these bulls and sends them toward the Romans, and the Romans think they're all men carrying torches just running crazily through the night, and so they break up their defensive posture. Hannibal manages to get through. Many of Fabius's men tell him, hey, they're in retreat, we should go after them. Fabius doesn't do it, though, partly probably because it's at night, partly because he's very cautious and he doesn't want to face another battle that might do even more damage to the army. But there's a lot of people, at the time at least, who say to him, and maybe arguably even today, could say, maybe that was an opportunity that you missed, Fabius. Maybe you should...
It definitely seems that way. Like, if you've got the enemy on the run, it's so much easier to reduce their number than if they're standing their ground. Like, even if all he was doing was firing volleys of arrows into like these fleeing portions and having his foot soldiers in front so they couldn't mount a counterattack, he probably would have been able to deal a substantial blow there.
Well, he didn't. And if you don't appreciate it, you can imagine how much less some of the people around him didn't appreciate it. Specifically, the man I mentioned earlier, the Master of Cavalry, Marcus Minucius Rufus, did not like this cautious approach that Fabius was taking. And at a certain point, Fabius is recalled to Rome to take place in an important religious ceremony. It's kind of like if the president was on the field leading the troops by direct order, but he had to go back home to be part of the Memorial Day parade or something like that. I'm trying to, maybe even more so, because he's got these religious duties that he has to attend to, and by all accounts, he's at least trying to look like a religious man, probably actually was at the time. And secondly, there's a lot of people back home who are kind of unhappy with how he's handling the war, and he's got to go and be political. So he leaves the army in the hands of Minucius. And he says, listen, keep going with the harassment and the slow and steady and the starvation approach. Do not attack Hannibal directly. Don't do it. You got it? And Minucius like, yeah, I got it. It's like, no, really, do you got it? And Minucius like, fine, yes, I've got it. So Fabius rides off to Rome. And wouldn't you know it, Minucius sees an opportunity to do a little damage to Hannibal right after Fabius is gone. Fabius is in Rome. Minucius is in charge of the whole army. Hannibal is admittedly, from everything I could read about this battle, a little bit open to attack, and Minucius cannot follow orders. He has to go and take a shot, and he takes a shot and does, in fact, in this skirmish, manage to inflict a little bit of damage on Hannibal.
As a cavalryman, you think that that'd be the type of guy who would want to wade in there and just get it done. Like, to see an opening and not take it after so many months of just doing the, like, passive, like, guarding and, like, the occasional go on the offensive to just make sure you do just a little damage. Like, he had to have been restless, his troopers had to have been restless, and, like, whenever they saw an opportunity, mounted on horseback and with the full legions behind them, they had to have been just chomping at the bit to go.
Well, he did see his opportunity, and he took it, and he killed 6,000 Carthaginians, or people who were allied to the Carthaginians. I'm not getting into all the little details of Hannibal's army here, but he had a lot of people from Italy who didn't necessarily appreciate Rome being in charge, specifically the Gauls. He has a lot of allies fighting for him. It's a complicated situation, the kind of situation that I think you could probably make a Game of Thrones style show about, and honestly,
probably
really have.
Well, they had that Rome show for a while, but I'm sure there are a lot of really fun sources on this one too. Like, I haven't read any books on Hannibal, but I own like 2 from Audible that I'm going to get to someday.
I actually just listened to a biography of Hannibal, which is how I got the idea for this episode, Tony. So Minucius kills 6,000 people of Hannibal's army. He forces Hannibal to withdraw, but he loses 5,000 of his own men. So it's not decisive, even in the casualty count, and he doesn't really do anything strategically damaging to Hannibal. Hannibal still has essentially all of the pieces that he had before. He has a few fewer guys, but he's not been forced into a corner where he can't fight. He just gets to move off and fight a different day with basically the same army minus a few thousand. Still, Rome, who you can imagine at this point is desperate for any news of any kind of a win against Hannibal, hails Minucius as a hero. Now, they can't get rid of Fabius. They like Minucius. They're like, yeah, you've just showed Hannibal who's boss. You can be in but they can't get rid of Fabius, so they just make Minucius a co-dictator, which really puts them back in sort of the consul situation that they were before, because now you have 2 people who have equal charge of the army, but that's the best they can do, again, while staying within the bounds of the law. The newly emboldened Minucius marched out with Fabius, intent on taking out the Carthaginians' army for good. But Hannibal had set a trap for the Roman forces, and as I mentioned a little bit at the beginning, this was Hannibal's MO. If there was ever a place to lie low and hide some guys where they could sneak up and not be seen until the battle was already pitched and the Romans weren't expecting it, he was definitely going to do that. And he has some of his army in hiding where the Romans won't see them. The Romans attack. Hannibal comes in from behind. Minucius and Fabius are leading 2 halves of the army, so it's Minucius's half that Hannibal attacks, and it's only because Fabius comes in and saves Minucius's bacon that Minucius is able to survive at all and survive with most of his section of the army. And that's the moment that Minucius sees the light. Minucius, once this battle is over, he realizes what Fabius has already realized, that Hannibal is a tough cookie, and you're not going to just smash into him with a big army on the battlefield and take him out. So Minucius and Fabius, they get on the same page, but the problem is Rome is not on the same page. The people back in Rome are still thirsty for a win. I mean, a real win. Kick this guy Hannibal out of our country, out of our boot here, get rid of him, send him back to Spain, send him all the way back to Africa where he belongs, and win this war once and for all. So Fabius and Minucius, their dictatorship comes to an end, and the Senate elects 2 new consuls. Gaius Terentius Varro, who was a plebeian who had worked his way up in the political structure through mostly populism by appealing to the rest of the plebeians, and he was actually the one who was responsible for lobbying that Minucius be co-ruler with Fabius in the first place, because he knew that Minucius was a go-getter, let's fight him kind of guy, and he knew that that would play well with the people. And the other person who gets elected is Lucius Aemilius Paulus. And this man was a hero of the Second Illyrian War. He's a little bit more patrician. He's sort of an elite type. He has had a triumph when he finally returns from the Second Illyrian War. And when they get these guys in power, they also slap Fabius with a nickname. They call Fabius the Cuncator. Cuncator. And that translates to the delayer. So Fabius the Warty gets added onto his name, Fabius the Delayer.
I really wish there were more titles, like in modern culture. Except I'd probably be Tony the Procrastinator. I
mean, we still do this, but it's not as official, right? We just sort of have fun with it.
I could be a Cuncator too, apparently.
Yes. So now we have these two new consuls who are both on the same page. They have an experienced defeat at the hands of Hannibal. They think, listen, this Fabius guy, he's just doesn't got it. He just doesn't have that Roman bloodlust for war that you really need to win. And if only we had some guys that were really willing to commit and hit this guy Hannibal hard, we could win. And so traditionally, each consul leads his own section of the army, but they combine their sections. Both consuls combine the army together into one massive army numbering 86,000 men, which was far more than Hannibal's army of 50,000.
Not to mention the quality of Roman soldiers in that era against most normal opponents would be like 3-1, like as far as like what a Roman soldier could do to an average soldier. But it sounds like Hannibal's troops were kind of on that level.
The top range of Hannibal's troops are on that level. The allies that he has from Rome, namely the Gauls, are more in line with tribal kind of cannon fodder types that Hannibal does use, and they are helpful, but they're not as up to snuff as the guys Hannibal starts with. Now, interesting fact about this, before these guys even get to where Hannibal's at, you have these two co-equal commanders who are leading the same army. You can't have two people leading the same army. So what they do, and this is maybe like in addition to all of the other things that are going to go wrong and not listening to Fabius, this is a bad idea. They split command every other day.
What?
Yeah, so one day Varro gets to be in charge, and then the day after that it's Paulus's turn, and then the next day it's Varro again, and then it goes back to Paulus, and so on. Every day.
That sounds like just a schizophrenic army.
Well, at least these guys were kind of on the same page, but yes, I read that and I thought, okay, this is not going to go well. Yeah. It's bad enough having two whole separate sections of the army both being co-equally led around in the area by guys who are equally powerful and one can't tell the other what to do. But to have them just sort of trading off as they go, it seems like even bigger problem.
Yeah, not to mention you're going to have officers that are more loyal to one side or the other. So if they're getting one thing, it's like, well, I can pretend to do this until tomorrow, then it'll be okay. Like, it just seems like a great way to, like, split discipline, like, kind of get your troops confused as to what their actual intent in their job is supposed to be. It's a logistical nightmare. Like, you can't switch every day. There's not two head coaches.
Well, at least the Romans have experience with Hannibal's tactics by now, Tony. And to review, these tactics are, and these are consistent over every battle that Hannibal fights with the Romans. He gives them a weak center. So you have your line of soldiers, right? Hannibal's line is always thinnest in the middle. He always attacks the flanks when he can, or he ambushes, or both. So, the Romans have attacked the center, and it's not gone well for them several times. So, of course, these two guys decide what we're going to do is we're going to have all our guys concentrate right in the center and just have like a real thin flank. The flank, not important. We're going to have a big tip of the spear that's just going to punch right through. They've already tried this, Tony.
Yeah, it's like, let's just let them fold around you like water.
Well, you're getting ahead of the story, but you're not wrong. Even more confusingly than everything else is the fact that neither one of the consuls is actually attached to this main center body that's going to attack. They are on the wings of the army in these weak flanks, one on either side, which means that they're not there to actually lead the main portion of the attack.
Whereas people like Caesar and all those other people would have insisted on being like right in the center of the action so that they could keep things rolling.
Right, not all the way in the front where you're shooting people. Like, you do have to have like a little detachment if you're a commander of an army, but you need to be where the fighting is, and neither one of these people is leading from the front. So the first encounter of the two armies was an assault by Hannibal's cavalries on the Roman flank. Both of these armies set up with their cavalries out on the flanks, and Hannibal's cavalry rushes forward from his flanks to harass these cavalrymen. On the right Roman flank, that cavalry is put into retreat, and Hannibal's guys go chasing after them, sort of off the map. On the left side, Hannibal's cavalry does kind of a dance with the Romans, where they advance and they back up, and they advance and they back up, and they're essentially just keeping the Romans occupied so that they can't do anything else with their cavalry. While the horsemen were doing their thing, the Roman infantry marched forward into the Carthaginians' intentionally weak center. And Hannibal is in the center of his army, despite the fact that it's the thinnest part of his setup, and he directs his guys to carefully, methodically fall back in front of the Roman advance. He lets the Romans think that they're doing something. They're pushing the Carthaginians back and back and back, and the Romans are thinking, this is going really well. Look at what we're doing. We are just rolling forward. These guys can't stand in front of us. They just keep going back further until the point where they realize that they haven't been pushing the whole army back. They've been pushing themselves into the center of this crescent that now starts to close like a circle around them. And if they were thinking about retreating, that hope is cut off too, because that cavalry section that at the beginning of the battle had chased after the Roman cavalry and sent them off somewhere else, those guys come circling back into the battle, into the rear, and close this circle that the Carthaginians have made around the Roman army. And the slaughter of the Roman army, once this encirclement takes place, was almost total. The numbers of Romans killed in this battle range between 67,000 and 85,000 of the original 86,000 men who marched out to meet the Carthaginians.
So you're talking about like a football stadium worth of like hand-to-hand fighters that just completely get annihilated, and that was the bulk of the entire Roman force.
It was literally all of their armies put together in one spot, now being circled by the Carthaginians and killed in a single day.
Did they not have the former consuls as like consultants on any of this stuff?
Nope, they're back in Rome getting called Cuncator all over the place. Probably spit on in the street. As far as I've been able to determine, this loss by the Roman army is the largest single death toll experienced by a single army in a single day of battle. There were more casualties in the first day of the Somme in World War I, but not all of those men were killed. And in the Battle of Borodino between Napoleon and the Russian army, there was a larger number of men killed, but it was split between the two sides. This is, I think, the largest number of men killed in a single army in a single day in world history.
And if you're talking about percentage-wise, it's probably pretty high up there too.
That's where we're going next, Tony, because some estimates put this percentage loss of Roman men at 20% of the adult male population. And if you want to contrast that to Germany in World War I, in the entire 4 to 5 years of fighting of World War I, Germany lost 6% of its adult male population. This was one day where Rome essentially loses almost everybody who can fight.
An entire fifth of their male population, too. That's insane.
And Hannibal, by contrast, loses 5,000 men.
If you're doing the math, that's one of the more resounding numbers I've ever heard, for any battle ever. Genghis Khan would be proud.
Hannibal's no joke. I recommend reading up on him if you have access to a book or an audio book or listen to a podcast or anything you can find about Hannibal. That dude knew what he was doing, and he still didn't win, Tony. That's the amazing thing about this story. The bad idea of the Battle of Cannae was that Rome was going to march out and meet Hannibal head on, and they were going to take this force down by brute strength. But they had ignored the good idea that was already right in front of them, and now, finally, just like Minucius had to get beat down real bad before he saw the wisdom of it, finally Rome sees the wisdom of Fabius's strategy of delaying. And Fabius does not get back to being dictator. They don't elect him dictator, but de facto, he kind of is the guy who's in charge from here on out. Rome as a whole realizes, oh man, we treated this guy wrong. It turns out he might have had the right idea. And Fabius steps up and he encourages the people of Rome. He gives them a period of mourning, but says you guys need to keep it inside. He starts rebuilding the army. He starts doing the things that need to be put together to continue enacting his Fabian strategy. And it's 13 years. 13 years later, Rome finally starves Hannibal out.
It's if this battle hadn't have happened, how long would it have taken, I wonder? It probably would have taken, not even half of that.
Possibly. It's very likely that could have happened. Rome finally does get to face Hannibal on the battlefield. Not in Italy itself, but Scipio Africanus takes the battle all the way back to Carthage, all the way back to Hannibal's hometown, and he gets there and beats Hannibal on his home turf, forcing him to withdraw and surrender, and the Second Punic War finally ends thanks to the Dictator.
Was that the Battle of Zama? I'm trying to remember.
I could not tell you, Tony. I don't have that one in front of me. I could look it up if you'd like.
I'm just curious because that was the one that they simulated in that movie Gladiator, where it was kind of one of the last stands of Hannibal's forces.
Battle of Zama, that is correct. I have just found it on Wikipedia. I'm sorry I did not have it in my notes.
No, it's okay. I was just curious. It's been a long time since I've read anything on this stuff, so I was just seeing if it was still retained.
It's really honestly the same lesson that should have been learned from 100 years earlier when Pyrrhus invaded and tried to do the same thing. It was another situation where you had someone who's a brilliant tactician, but all you had to do was keep him from resupplying himself, and eventually he wouldn't be able to continue fighting on the soil of the Romans.
Yeah, but none of them thought that they were the next Alexander. Well, Scipio might have.
Scipio might have been. He seems like he did okay, Africanus.
And legit Hannibal might have been as well, from what I'm reading, except he probably lived longer than Alexander.
Yes, he actually finally committed suicide rather than being dragged back to Rome to be tried for his quote-unquote crimes of being sneaky and hiding his guys when he attacked. I think that's probably a better choice than letting whatever the Romans were going to do to him over the coming months. So, to recap, the bad idea is rushing in when it's better to hang back. The Romans thought that the raw strength that they could command on the battlefield would be enough to help them win this, and they didn't consider the cautious strategy that Fabius was putting forth. And it's understandable. They wanted to be proud, they wanted to think of themselves as the toughest guys in the room, but they weren't able to see the danger of the thing that they were up against. And by underestimating it and by not listening to the wiser, more cautious men among them, they almost got themselves wiped out. The people who actually did march into battle got themselves wiped out, and it was only by an amazing turnaround and just gritting of the teeth of the Roman populace that they wouldn't give up, that they were able to push Hannibal out and finally win the war. It's a fascinating era of history. I recommend everybody look into it. I haven't been able to do it the justice that I think it deserves. There's so much fascinating, rich stuff in here throughout all of Roman history that you start digging and you see things that you never would have imagined, and it's really a lot of fun. I had a blast researching this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed hearing it. If you have ideas that you think that we should cover, you should send them into badideasshow@gmail.com, which is our email address, if you couldn't tell, where we get lots of bad ideas from that we cover on the show, and we enjoy reading all of those. And if you enjoy this show, you should subscribe to it if you're not doing that already on whatever your favorite podcast player is, and leave us a review wherever it is that you can leave podcast reviews these days. Tony, is iTunes still up?
iTunes is still up. Spotify has reviews, things like that.
Spotify has reviews. Yes, do a Spotify review, please. That would really be lovely. If you wouldn't mind,
Yep.
and you have the time, and you have a Spotify, leave us a review over there.
All right. I hope you guys have an excellent week, and we will see you with more bad ideas.
Bye!